You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 330, The Evacuation of New York. Last week we covered the signing of the peace treaty ending the war, but the British still had an army occupying New York in the fall of 1783. Both sides needed to figure out how to disentangle the two armies and implement the peace treaty. General Guy Carleton had become commander of North American forces in early 1782 after London received word of the British surrender at Yorktown, and they of course wanted to replace General Henry Clinton. Carleton received his assignments just weeks before the fall of the North government in London. The new government under Lord Shelburne took power before he left and continued to support his taking command of North America. Carleton and Admiral Robert Digby were named Joint Peace Commissioners. Their assignment was to end the war in America, but try to find some way to reconcile and reunite Great Britain and the colonies. Now, shortly after his arrival in New York, Carleton received word that Prime Minister Shelburne's new government was prepared to recognize U.S. independence unconditionally, and that Carleton's job was simply to find a way to evacuate the army and the loyalist civilians. Carleton asked to resign his command, not simply wanting to oversee an evacuation, but they convinced him to stay and complete the task of evacuation. The task of removing an army was not an easy one. The British had roughly 30,000 British and Hessian soldiers, including thousands of prisoners that were still held by the Americans. Carleton also had probably an equal number, maybe even more, loyalist civilians who wanted to leave with the army. Carleton had to remove everyone, while of course avoiding the risk of an enemy attack before the withdrawal was complete. Through much of 1783, Carleton managed the process of removing soldiers and loyalists from New York. He made little progress since the numbers of loyalists seeking refuge in the city and the return of British and Hessian prisoners often more than made up for those that he was able to ship out of the city. Many of these people were forced to live in tents on Long Island, awaiting an opportunity to leave. An important factor in how fast people could leave the city was the availability of ships. Carleton set up an office of superintendent of exports and imports to manage the process. He could not get a good answer as to how many refugees many locations could handle. For example, Carleton had to send agents to Nova Scotia to assess things like timber reserves, arable land, and availability of water to get a better idea of how many refugees he could send there that could be settled with the resources that existed. He also had to be concerned with how the resettlements would be coordinated. In one instance, the general appointed 3 loyalist colonels, Edward Winslow, Isaac Brown, and Stephen Delancey, to serve as agents for more than 5,000 loyalist soldiers who were being settled in New Brunswick. These refugees would create entire new communities out of almost nothing. Refugees, of course, were free to go wherever they could get transport, and many others moved to places like Bermuda, Nassau, the Bahamas, as well as back to England. While dealing with the evacuation and the logistics that involved with it, Carleton also had to deal with a problem of corruption. Administrators, both civilian and military, expected kickbacks for just about anything. British guards, still holding American prisoners, regularly took meager food requisitions and sold them on the open market, allowing the prisoners to starve. The prices of nearly everything the army purchased were double the market value, thanks to all the kickbacks that were expected. Rather than investigate and prosecute all of this, Carleton simply fired or reassigned virtually everyone involved with procurements and expenditures, replacing them all with new men. This, of course, led to complications as new administrators had to figure out how to get things done. Carleton also created a board to inspect the financial records, similar to a commission that he had overseen in London a few years before. This Board of Public Accounts was headed by Colonel Duncan Drummond, who I discussed back in episode 308. Back in that episode, Drummond had opened up an inquiry into corruption that then General Henry Clinton had quashed, because it was right after Yorktown, and Clinton didn't want to send more bad news to London. Drummond got his investigation moving forward under General Carleton. Also on the board was Henry White, a civilian merchant who had provided supplies to the British Army under General Howe much earlier in the war, as well as another merchant, Hugh Wallace. So rather than sweep this problem under the table like his predecessors, Carleton personally chaired many of these weekly meetings to get to the bottom of British Army corruption. In April of 1783, this was before Washington dismantled his army over the summer, Washington wrote to Carleton about an exchange of prisoners. Washington was willing to return the 6,000 soldiers captured at Yorktown if Carleton could provide ships to transport them. Carleton replied that all his ships were tied up, moving men and equipment out of New York, and that the prisoners would have to march from Virginia to New York. Washington also suggested that they meet to discuss cooperation in the orderly withdrawal of the British Army from New York. Several of Carleton's advisors thought that such a meeting would be problematic. In earlier meetings, American negotiators had tried to get Britain to pay for the care of British prisoners while they were in American custody. Carleton's advisors were afraid that this might become an issue at the meeting and that it would hold up the release of the British prisoners. Carleton overruled his advisors and agreed to the meeting anyway. He took with him a civilian loyalist, Judge William Smith, and 2 military aides. They agreed to meet with Washington at Tappan, where the Americans had hanged Major John Andre less than 3 years prior. The location was a convenient ride from Washington's headquarters and easily accessible up the Hudson River by a British ship. Washington brought with him his secretary, Jonathan Trumbull, as well as New York Governor George Clinton, along with New York Secretary of State and Attorney General, to discuss any civilian state issues that were relevant. The meeting was pretty cordial, but they got right down to business. Washington put 3 issues on the table. He wanted to be assured that the British would return slaves that were under their control as per the peace treaty. Next, he wanted to come to an agreement on the exact date when British troops would leave New York City. And finally, he requested that the British turn over control of Westchester County and Long Island within the next few days. Carleton really couldn't agree to any of these terms. The date of the final evacuation would still be some time away. Carleton was dealing with issues related to moving thousands of men and equipment, and any schedule was going to be largely dependent on the availability of ships and the weather. He assured the Americans that he wanted to leave as quickly as possible, and he was working on that end, but he couldn't give them a date certain. As far as giving up land, Carleton was willing to turn over control of Westchester County. He still needed Long Island, though, where he had thousands of refugees awaiting departure. He just couldn't cram all these people into the city. The question of slaves was the most contentious. Carleton simply refused to turn over men who had accepted British offers of freedom in exchange for supporting the crown. Many of these men had served under arms. Many others had served in a civilian capacity. He was not going to return them to slavery. Instead, Carleton noted that he would keep track of those he evacuated and that the owners could be compensated for their value. This position seemed to be a direct violation of the peace treaty. Carleton agreed to allow American inspectors at the docks to assure that the list of Negro evacuees was as accurate as possible, but that was as far as he was willing to go. After an afternoon of arguing, the 2 sides sat down to dinner with one another, prepared by Samuel Francis of Francis Tavern. Then the Americans joined the British aboard ship for more drinks and informal discussions. Washington did end up sending inspectors to monitor the black people being evacuated. As he expected, many of the former slaves gave false names and lied about their owners or their status before the war. In the end, Carleton did not return any refugees to slavery, and no owner ever received any compensation for their losses. The issue of exchanging prisoners turned out to be a complicated one. Remember, the Huddy Asgill affair only ended in late 1782, when Captain Asgill was finally permitted his release. Tensions only seemed to ease once both sides accepted that the peace treaty really was bringing the war to an end. And even after that, at one point the Americans considered not returning the British prisoners in protest of Carleton not returning their slaves. Cooler heads prevailed, however, and the Americans agreed to the return. Even so, collecting the thousands of prisoners that had been spread out among inland towns proved difficult. Many British officers who had received parole had to be called back. Many Hessian prisoners had opted to remain in America. Some Hessians had joined the Continental Army. Others were offered an opportunity to repay a debt while working a civilian job in order to obtain American citizenship. So these all had to be figured out. Then there was the need to find food and supplies to march the prisoner armies from Virginia to New York. The Americans had been prepared to turn over their prisoners by April of 1783, but because they had to march the prisoners to New York, the final exchange didn't take place until late May. For the British, release of prisoners also came with some difficulty. Carleton began releasing some of his sickliest prisoners shortly after he arrived in early 1782, and he had released all of his army prisoners by the end of that year. After his corruption hearings turned up the fact that agents were selling food that was meant for American prisoners, Carleton also began investigating the conditions of naval prisoners who were being held on the prison ships in New York Harbor. These fell under the jurisdiction of the Navy. Despite this, Carleton received permission from Admiral Digby to inspect the ships. When he found the deplorable conditions, he prevailed on the admiral to allow the prisoners to be removed from the ships during the hottest days of the summer and put them on Blackwell Island in the East River. This is what we today call Roosevelt Island. Over the winter, Carleton authorized the purchase of clothing to help keep these prisoners warm. Britain also had hundreds of American sailors in British prisons back in Britain. Benjamin Franklin helped coordinate their release and repatriation to America. By July of 1783, Washington wrote to Secretary of War Benjamin Lincoln that the last American-held prisoners, a group of Hessians, were on their way back to New York. All prisoners on both sides who had survived the war were either home or on the way. Loyalists continued to stream into New York, seeking transportation to anywhere more friendly. When the British evacuated Westchester County about a week after the Tappan Conference in May, violence against Loyalist citizens who remained behind in the county spiked. Washington had to send in Continental soldiers to restore order. And many of the Loyalists still held out hope for some sort of compromise that would allow them to remain in America. Even as late as the summer of 1783, Judge Smith, who had attended the Tappan Conference with General Carleton, wondered if Washington might still be part of a secret plan to bring about a reunion between Britain and her colonies. Rumors of Congress's move from Philadelphia to Princeton gave some Loyalists hope of a compromise, since Congress was finally separated from French Minister Luzerne, who remained in Philadelphia. Many Loyalists believed that the Patriots were simply held in thrall by the French, and getting away from them might make them come to their senses. Now, these notions seem to be based on some desperate hope more than any reality. The stories of Loyalists streaming into New York during 1783 should have been a much better indicator of what awaited the New York Loyalists who did not leave with the British Army. Pamphlets also entered the city, threatening horrors and vengeance on any Loyalists who remained behind. Now, not everyone, of course, thought this way. Colonel Alexander Hamilton visited New York City in August, looking forward to setting up a law practice there. While he was there, he met with General Carleton, expressing concern that almost all New York's merchants were fleeing the city. This would make rebuilding New York's economy much more difficult. Carleton, unwilling to provide Hamilton with much information, did not respond but simply shrugged his shoulders. In the fall of 1782, British intelligence captured Thomas Poole in New York. He had been in possession of incriminating documents and confessed to being a spy. His mission had been to collect information on Americans who were collaborating with the British in order to take action against them after the British left. Now, this put Carleton in a difficult situation. Hanging an American spy just as they were getting the Huddy Asgill affair behind them would have caused all sorts of problems. At the same time, Carleton did not want Poole being able to report back to New York officials on collaborators who might end up remaining behind. Instead, Carleton shipped him off to Bermuda, along with a letter to the governor, letting him know that Poole was a spy. He claimed that he was not executed for reasons of, quote, humanity, but that he had knowledge that would endanger other loyalists. Poole could not be held in prison since he had become very decrepit during his imprisonment in New York. Carleton asked that Poole be held in Bermuda or some other island where he could not return to America. Despite this, 6 months later, in May 1783, Poole did arrive back in New York. The Bermuda governor said he had recovered his health and that Poole should be exchanged with the other prisoners. Once again, Carleton sent Poole back to Bermuda. He sent another note essentially saying, "Look, we need to keep this guy out of America. He's a direct threat to many loyalists. He's not a prisoner of war and not subject to any exchanges. We need to keep him out of the country until things cool off." And set up a series of back and forth letters. The governor of Bermuda essentially saying that if he's a prisoner, he should be exchanged. If he's not a prisoner, we don't have any right to hold him. In the end, Poole went to South Carolina. It's not clear if he came back to New York later, but he apparently wasn't a problem for Carleton again after that time. Throughout the summer and fall of 1783, both Washington and the Continental Congress repeatedly pushed Carleton for a final evacuation date. Carleton, however, would not leave until he found refuge for all the Loyalists, many of whom were still entering New York. Though Carleton wanted to go home as much as anyone, he couldn't bear the idea of Loyalists suffering the wrath of the Patriots if they were left behind. That fall, Carleton sent a messenger to London with his thoughts about keeping an army of more than 10,000 regulars and sessions in New York over the next winter. Before that messenger could even arrive in London, Carleton received a message saying that he needed to evacuate New York right away. He could not just keep delaying the final evacuation. So, on November 12, 1783, Carleton wrote to Washington saying that he expected to be able to make his final withdrawal before the end of the month. He would abandon King's Bridge on November 21st, giving the Patriots access to northern Manhattan. He would also relinquish Long Island that same day, holding only the main city as well as Brooklyn, Paulus Hook, and Staten Island. Carleton wrote again a week later to make sure Washington was coordinating the changeover and wanted to be assured that the Americans would not allow violence and lawlessness to follow the British withdrawal, as it had in Westchester. Washington wrote back to assure Carleton that he and state officials were prepared to move into the city as soon as the British left. On November 21st, Washington led the Continental Army onto Manhattan for the first time since his retreat in 1776. Since most of his army had already gone home, his Continental Army consisted of about 800 men, accompanied by some New York militia. He took up temporary lodging at a tavern in Harlem, awaiting the final British evacuation. 4 days later, on November 25th, the last British soldiers boarded ships at the pier and pulled away into the harbor. A signal blast of 13 cannons signaled to Washington that his army should advance. Washington marched his army into the city. Riding with Washington was Governor Clinton, with a staff prepared to resume civilian control of the city. Other top civilian leaders marched with the army as well. General Henry Knox was given the honor of leading the march into the city. The transition took place without any real incidents. The only problem for the Americans was that the British had nailed a British flag to the pole at the battery in the southern tip of the island, and the British had removed the halyard and greased the flagpole in order to prevent the Americans from raising their flag. It took several hours to get someone who could scale the pole and raise the American flag, and soon American flags began to appear all over town. The British fleet remained in the harbor for nearly a week, awaiting favorable winds. On December 1st, Carleton sent a final letter to Washington, announcing the fleet's departure. The following day, Washington wrote back saying, quote, "I sincerely wish that Your Excellency, with the troops under your orders, may have a safe and pleasant passage." I wish I could end on that polite and gentlemanly note, but as the fleet sailed out over the next few days, boisterous New Yorkers on Staten Island fired their guns into the air and made some not-so-polite hand gestures at the departing fleet. In response, a British warship fired a cannonball at the shore, causing the spectators to disperse. With that final parting shot, the British sailed from New York, ending their occupation. The war was really over. Next week, with its mission accomplished, the Continental Army disbands once and for all. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, and Michael Mulhern. And thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Richard McCabe, TJ Walker, and Curtis Johnson. Thanks to Mike Ditch and Andy James, who joined as standard bearers last month. They will be getting their first monthly flag magnet this month, and will get a new flag each month with a different flag from the American Revolution. I also want to thank Jason Cole for a one-time gift via PayPal. I really do appreciate everyone who helps to support this podcast. This week, we covered the British Army's evacuation of New York. This was almost the last of the British presence in the United States. The British garrison at Detroit remained for a long time after this. A British garrison actually remained in Detroit until it was finally abandoned as part of the Jay Treaty in 1796. The evacuation of New York, however, was considered the end of the British presence in the United States, and the evacuation took months. Thousands of people and their property were moving with a limited number of ships. General Guy Carleton saw this as an issue of national honor. He was horrified at the idea of leaving loyal British subjects behind, knowing that they would suffer terribly only because they had been loyal to the crown. He wanted to help them ship with as much of their property as they could take with them, because, sending civilians off to a foreign land with just the clothes on their backs was not much a reward for their loyalty either. I've seen some estimates that over 35,000 civilians left through New York during the war, and almost all of these left in the final year of British occupation, after Carleton replaced Henry Clinton as commander in North America. Carleton had a reputation for being very stiff and formal, even much more so than his predecessors, Howe and Clinton. He also had a reputation, though, for scrupulous honesty, which is why he put so much effort into cutting down on the corruption in the British supply efforts. After the war, Carleton still had a pretty significant political career ahead of him. He was an important advisor in handling the refugees in the years after the war. Carleton did remain in England for several years after he returned. Because so many loyalists had settled in Canada after the war, the population there exploded. Carleton recommended separating New Brunswick from Nova Scotia to create a new colony, which was populated primarily by loyalist refugees who had left what was now the United States. When the New Brunswick province was established, Carleton helped his brother, Thomas Carleton, get appointed as the colony's first leader. Carleton remained close to William Smith, who had been Chief Justice of New York before the war. Smith had served as the civilian advisor to Carleton in New York, and I talked about him attending the conference with Washington in 1783 along with Carleton. The two men sailed for England together after the evacuation as they had become good friends, and Carleton helped Smith get an appointment as Chief Justice of Quebec after the war. Now, the British weren't really sure how to govern Canada after this point. They created a governor to govern all of the provinces, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, but the governor only really ruled the colony he was in at a given time. Otherwise, there was a lieutenant governor that ran each colony most of the time. Carleton lobbied for a proper commander to coordinate governing over all the colonies at once, and finally that happened in 1786. The government created a new position that governed all three provinces as well as Newfoundland. Carleton got the job of commanding all of this, and he also got a new title as the Baron Dorchester. Carleton also lobbied to restrict trade between the United States and the British West Indies. He became a huge advocate for Canada and believed that the Canadian provinces could provide the islands with the resources that they needed from North America. The independent U.S. should be isolated on trade and made to feel the pain of leaving the British Empire. Later, Carleton oversaw the division of Canada once again into Upper Canada and Lower Canada. This was part of an effort to impose taxes on Canada, but learning from the Revolution, doing so by establishing locally elected assemblies to levy those taxes. This, along with the appointment of John Graves Simcoe as Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, led to Carleton's increased frustration and his eventual resignation in 1796. Carleton returned to England. He remained a general of the army, but really took no role in the next war with France, and instead simply enjoyed his retirement among the 3 estates that he had in England. If you want to read more about Guy Carleton, my book recommendation this week is Guy Carleton, A Biography by Paul Reynolds. It's a relatively short book given the many events of Carleton's life, and he really is seen as a founder of the nation of Canada today. The author of this book, Paul Revere Reynolds, was a literary agent, and he published this book in 1980, passed away in 1988. But if you want to read more about Guy Carleton, his book, Guy Carleton, A Biography, is worth reading. My online recommendation is an article called A Tory Eye View of the Evacuation of New York, which was first published in New York History magazine in 1983. It's got several really good eyewitness accounts of the actual evacuation. The article is on JSTOR, which means you have to register for a free account to read it, but I have included direct links to the article on my blog and website. My question this week comes from Brian Rome, who asks, what did the Americans of 1760 to 1790 think of jury nullification? It's come up a few times over the course of the podcast. Was it considered a bug or a feature of jury trials by men of the day? Well, Brian, let's start with what jury nullification is, so we're sure everyone understands that. In a jury trial, the jury has an absolute final say over the innocence of the accused. If a jury finds someone guilty, a judge can set aside that verdict and set the accused free anyway. If a jury finds someone not guilty, the judge has no choice but to accept that finding. Jury nullification is simply the term for when a jury simply finds the defendant not guilty despite indisputable evidence of guilt. It usually happens when the jury either dislikes the law or simply thinks that its application in a particular case is just morally wrong. Americans in the colonial era liked jury nullification. In many instances, colonial governments did not reflect popular views in their laws, so jury nullification was effectively a way to veto the application of those laws. Royal governments were frustrated when patriots who were charged with a crime were found not guilty, even with evidence that was overwhelming. It was because the juries were chosen from people who were quite happy that law-breaking was taking place. There are numerous examples of patriots breaking the laws in Boston and just having juries let them go free. Most of Boston supported that law-breaking as part of an overall effort to resist unjust taxation and later the Intolerable Acts was perfectly fine. In this time period, the people could not control what laws were enacted over them, but they could control whether they could be enforced. Therefore, jury nullification was a tool to be used against tyranny. That was also why many colonists objected to trials being moved to other locations where juries might not be as sympathetic to the accused. John Adams clearly was an advocate of nullification, for example. I got the following quote from him, quote, "Now, should the melancholy case arise that the judges should give their opinions to the jury against one of these fundamental principles, is a jury obligated to give his verdict generally according to this direction, or even find the facts specifically and submit the law to the court? Every man of any feeling or conscience will answer no. It is not only right, but his duty in that case to find the verdict according to his own best understanding, judgment, and conscience, though in direct opposition to the direction of the court." In other words, Adams believed jurors had a duty to use their own judgment and not simply come to an answer on the facts. After the Revolutionary War ended, jury nullification was still a very popular tool. Many cases involved farmers who were fighting debt from Eastern lenders or who objected to taxation that they believed unfairly singled them out to pay what they regarded as a disproportionate level of taxation. Jury nullification and other actions to prevent foreclosures were just seen as part of the effort to resist these unfair laws. Now, part of the reason that jury trials are explicitly guaranteed in the U.S. Constitution is that the founders believed that juries were a bulwark of liberty and that jury nullification was part of the protection against laws that communities believed to be unjust. Jury nullification continued to play a role when localities had laws forced upon them, often by the federal government. We see jury nullification playing a role in freeing people in the mid-19th century who helped escape slaves in the North in violation of the hated Fugitive Slave Act. Now, while many of us may like that example, we also have to remember that jury nullification was used by many Southern racists after the Civil War. White juries would free white defendants who had committed crimes against black people because local communities were just okay with that. By the 1830s or so, courts were already beginning to move away from the idea that jurors could use their personal conscience to decide whatever verdict they liked. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1895 held conclusively that juries should be limited to determining the facts and not using personal conscience to reach their verdict. So today, judges and juries must instruct jurors to stick to a determination of the fact, and that's all. Juries can still choose to act on their own, but they're never given that instruction. During the founding era, that view was very different. Jurors were considered the ultimate arbiters of a defendant's fate and could make whatever decisions they liked, and were often told that by the judge or jury. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me, either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.